This story revolves around an old biology professor who started appearing in all of his students' dreams, and no one has a clue why it's happening. He became famous, and all of the people who saw him on social media started dreaming about him. One of them even had a sexual dream. However, when his nighttime appearances take a nightmarish turn, he is forced to navigate the consequences of his newfound stardom. Hello, welcome to I Am Movies. Today we're looking into the 2023 American black comedy fantasy film called Dream Scenario. But before we jump into the details, make sure to show us some love by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Now, let's get right into it. Spoilers alert, watch out and take care. The movie begins with a man named Paul Matthews, an evolution biology professor who strangely appears in people's dreams. The first case of this incident is experienced by his daughter Sophie, who recalls calling him for his help in her dream as she floats in the air. However, Paul just kept staring helplessly at her in the dream. On hearing this, Paul reassures Sophie that he's not the kind of father who will stand and watch his daughter get hurt, reminding her that he once saved her from drowning when she was just 4 years old. Later that day, Paul gives a lecture on the evolutionary benefits of zebras' stripes, telling his students that zebras survive by blending in with the rest of the herd, and that those that stick out are easily targeted by predators. Now later that day, Paul goes to a fancy restaurant to meet up with an old friend from grad school named Sheila. On getting there, the desk lady suggests that she might have seen Paul before. However, Paul tells her he has not been in the restaurant ever before. Shortly after, Paul meets with Sheila, who is now a successful publisher. Now, Paul believes that Sheila stole his idea on the way ants live, which he jokingly termed antelligence while they were still in grad school. However, Sheila denies stealing his ideas, stating that he can be a professor without being a researcher like her, seeing that he's now helpless against her, since he has no prior work to prove he truly owns the work. Paul resorts to begging her to give him credit in her book, but she still refuses. Now, aside from wanting to be credited for his idea, in order to boost his career as a professor, Paul is also enthusiastic about writing his own book, but he's yet to start putting his ideas into writing. Later that same day, Paul goes to see a movie with his wife Janet. After the movie, Paul's journalist ex-girlfriend Claire spots him with his wife, and they both exchange pleasantries. At this time, Claire reveals that Paul has been on his mind lately because he keeps popping up in her dreams as a bystander. She narrates one of her dreams where she's holding one of her friends who just had an accident in the middle of the road, and Paul just appeared out of nowhere, waving at her without helping out. Then Claire suggests they meet over a cup of coffee later to sort out old grudges. The next day, Claire and Paul meet up in a coffee shop, and she asks him if she could write about her dreams in a blog, and Paul agrees. The next day at school, people begin to murmur about how they've been weirdly seeing Paul in their dreams. Paul notices this and goes to ask his friend, Brett, who is also the dean of the school, if he's been dreaming about him lately. Brett gets confused by this question, revealing how unsettling he feels about what Paul just asked him. During dinner, Paul alongside his wife asks their kids, Sophie and Hannah, to put away their phones in order to have a family conversation. However, the conversation gets interrupted when Paul receives a call from one of his fellow professor friends, Richard. During this call, Richard reveals to Paul that his wife, Carlota, and colleague Naomi have both report seeing him in their dreams. On hearing this, Paul collapses on the floor and his wife rushes to check on him. Later, Paul finds out that Claire had published the story of her dream on Facebook and even left a link to his social media page for her readers, prompting thousands of people to connect him to the man they see in their dreams. With this, Paul begins to draw attention from the media but seems frustrated by his role in their dreams. One day in class, Paul decides to listen to the dreams his students have been having about him. One student report dreaming about being in a forest where he gets attacked by a strange-looking man, stating that he begged Paul to save him, but Paul only kept staring at a tree covered in mushrooms. Another student reports seeing Paul casually stroll through the school during an earthquake as students panic and fall to their deaths. Then another reports seeing Paul watching him as he pulls out his teeth, while another one reports seeing him watch her as she gets attacked by crocodiles. Paul soon realizes that they've all had dreams where they needed his help, but all he did was helplessly watch them, just like in Sophie's dream. However, Paul continues to gain popularity, and everyone just wants to be associated with him, and soon gets an invitation to Richard's dinner party, which he's been longing for. Now, regardless of the dream epidemic, Janet has never had any such strange dreams about Paul. So, Janet asks Paul why he isn't appearing in her dream, telling him that she wants to dream about him rescuing her like a superhero, while wearing an old Halloween costume inspired by an oversized suit that Talking Heads frontman David Byrne often wore during concerts. Later that night, a mentally ill man who has also been having dreams about Paul breaks into his house with a knife in an attempt to kill him. But as soon as this mentally ill man sees Paul, he breaks down in tears and Janet calls the police. In the morning, a detective advises Paul to either move out of the house or install alarms and security cameras. With this, Paul decides to seek Brett's advice about the incident. Brett tells him to stay away from the public eye because more people may tend to keep seeing him in their dreams if he keeps appearing on TV. However, Paul decides to use this new fame to his advantage, stating that he'll strike a deal with any publishing firm to get his book done. The next day, Paul flies to honors an invitation sent by a PR firm known as Thoughts to sign a book deal. On his way up in the elevator, the secretary of the firm, Molly tells him that she's been seeing him in her dream every day nonstop. While leaving, Molly asks Paul if he has anything to do tonight and gives her number. On getting back to his hotel room, Paul excitedly informs Janet about the good news. During the call, Paul realizes that Janet is at home and currently with one of her co-workers, Chris, and he seems bothered about it. So that night, Paul decides to have a drink with Molly, as they talk about Paul's dream epidemic and how people around the world perceive it. Shortly after, Paul asks Molly to tell him the details of her dream, and she tells him that it's embarrassing to say. However, Paul convinces her to say it, stating that it's just a dream and he won't judge her. With this, Molly reveals to Paul that she often has erotic dreams about him, stating that he often breaks into her house at night, and they both usually have intense, intimate moments in her dreams. Paul is shocked to hear that he finally does something in someone's dream, other than just passively standing around. Shortly after getting more drinks, Molly invites Paul to her place, requesting that Paul help her recreate her dream, just the way it usually happens. Although Paul reminds Molly that he's married, Molly doesn't care, as she wanted to feel in real life the erotic dream she keep on having with Paul. They soon begin to kiss and Molly instructs Paul what he needs to do. But Molly notices that she needs to lead Paul since he is quite old. While opening his zipper, Paul being an old man as he is, he prematurely ejaculates, leaving Molly upset and prompting Paul to leave humiliated. The following day, Paul learns that Sheila has now published her book on intelligence, which happens to be the same idea he wanted to base his book on, and he gets enraged. Meanwhile, people begin to start having serious nightmares about getting violently attacked by Paul in their dreams. One of his students, Greta, dreams about getting choked to death by Paul. Another student dreams of Paul bashing him to death with a hammer. The next day, Paul gets to class and finds out that only a few of his students are in attendance. He decides to report it to Brett, stating that the students can't just decide to skip classes because of a nightmare. However, Brett reveals to him that it's now out of control because some of the students now report getting sexually molested by Paul in their dreams, subsequently feeling traumatized. Nevertheless, Paul argues that trauma is just a trend these days, stating that the students need to grow up. Days later, Paul and Janet finally visit Richard and his wife after waiting to be invited for a long time, but they soon realize other people have refused to attend the dinner party because of Paul. During dinner, Paul notices that Carlota is acting strange towards him, as she has refused to look him in the eye. Later, after Carlota almost choked on her food, she gets a flashback at the details of her most recent dream, where Paul used a string to choke her to death and she walks away. Concerned about Carlota, Janet and Paul ask Richard what could have gone wrong, and he finally reveals the grim details of Carlota's dream to them and immediately asks them to leave. With the situation on the ground, the school decides to run a therapy session for students who have been having nightmares about Paul. A therapist known as Candace addresses the students and later introduces Paul to them from a distance, asking the student to state the moment they feel uncomfortable seeing him. However, as Paul steps in and gets close to the students, some of them begin to feel scared and one of them gets up to leave, prompting the others to follow suit. Later that day, Paul walks to his car to go home, and soon realizes that the students have paint sprayed the word loser on his car. Paul angrily yells at them as he demands to know who did it, but all they did was film him. During dinner that night, Paul reveals to his family that he has been asked to take some time off work, stating that he would use that time to focus on his book. However, Hannah asks him what he did that made the scene of the dreams change. Paul tells her that he did not do anything, but Hannah tells him that thousands of people are tweeting about his torture, rape, and all. Paul angrily shuts her up, stating that there will no longer be any discussion about dreams during dinner. Meanwhile, Paul begins to get bored staying at home and decides to reach out to some of his friends, but nobody wants to speak with him. Days later, Paul gets a call from the PR firm who then informs him that they need to change strategy because he's getting canceled in corporate spaces and would need to get on a popular show like Joe Rogan's to speak about his experience getting canceled. However, Paul opposes their idea, stating that he doesn't want to be controversial or get himself involved in any culture war. One day, while having lunch in a restaurant, a waitress approaches him to tell him that people are beginning to get bothered about his presence, but Paul argues that he's not caused any harm, stating that if they feel uncomfortable, they should leave. Soon, a man walks up to him and asks him to leave the restaurant, stating that nobody wants him around. However, Paul tells the man that he has no plans of leaving. Then, the man picks up Paul's plate of food and spits in it, prompting Paul to retaliate, which subsequently leads to a brawl. Moments later, Janet tells Paul to make a public statement by apologizing to everyone, but he refuses, stating that he's the victim here. However, Janet reminds him that the whole thing is affecting her career, stating that she almost lost her job and that their kids are getting picked on. Later that night, Paul has a nightmare where he gets attacked by a strange man shooting arrows at him with a crossbow as he tries to escape. Later, Paul manages to get to the front of his house, but he soon realizes that the strange man is himself and he gets shot in the throat. Subsequently, Paul gets banned from attending Sophie's stage play, but he refuses to agree with them, stating that they are only trying to exile him, and he even gets angrier, seeing that Janet wouldn't take his side. With this, Paul decides to release a self-pitying apology video to appease the public, but his kids feel embarrassed watching him fake his tears on camera, and Janet subsequently sends him out of the house. Now homeless, Brett offers Paul a space in his basement to sleep till he gets a new place for himself. However, on the day of the play, Paul tries to force his way into Sophie's school play that he was already instructed not to attend, only to accidentally injure a teacher in the process. During this commotion, Paul sees Chris sitting beside Janet and soon begins to protest as he subsequently gets removed by other attendees. Months after this incident, people suddenly stopped dreaming about Paul Matthews, but his phenomenon brought a revolution in dream science, leading to the creation of a dream travel technology called Norio. The Norio serves as a discovery of a shared dream which is advertised to people while they sleep. With the Norio, people can visit anyone in their dreams and promote music, arts, or just simply talking to them. After this crazy revolution, we see Paul and his daughters checking out his new place. With Paul and Janet having separated, Paul decides to get himself a new house. After that, Paul drops Hannah and Sophie off at Janet's house. Paul asks them how frequently Chris, Janet's co-worker, come there, but the girls both decide to keep their mouth shut. Moments later, Paul tells Janet that he'll be away for a while because he needs to go to France for the final publication of his book. However, Paul goes on a mediocre tour in France to sell his autobiography, Dream Scenario, which he soon realizes that the title has been changed without his consent to I Am Your Nightmare in French. Later, Paul uses the Norio dream travel technology to venture into one of Janet's dreams and save her life, while wearing the David Byrne suit costume she once requested him to wear. After spending some time with Janet, Paul wishes the dream is real, but he soon floats away as Janet awakens from her sleep. And this leads us to a hanging ending. If you'd like to see us recap any other movies or topics you have in mind, just drop a comment and let us know. And don't forget to hit the like button, share this recap, and subscribe to stay updated for the next one. Until next time.